On July 8, 2016, the Utah Court of Appeals issued a second decision in the case of Woodward v. Lafranca. A link to that decision is provided here, as well as in the description section of this video report. The district court entered a custody order that the Court of Appeals, on appeal filed by the father, reversed and remanded to address problems it found with the trial court's findings and conclusions. On remand, the district court made several additional findings but essentially kept its custody order unchanged. The father appealed against, but the Court of Appeals affirmed it determined that the trial court substantially complied with the mandate of the Court of Appeals' prior decision. At trial, the trial court heard testimony from mother and father, as well as from several experts, including a custody evaluator, child therapist, and a court-appointed special master. Although the expert testimony overwhelmingly supported the father, the trial court found that each expert lacked, for one reason or another, credibility or persuasiveness. So the trial court, relying primarily on mother's testimony, denied father's petition to modify custody. The trial court originally dismissed as incredible the testimony of all the expert witnesses who testified at trial, therapist evaluator and court-appointed special master, and made a number of factual findings and legal conclusions, almost all of which favored mother. In father's original appeal, the Court of Appeals held that the trial court failed to adequately explain and justify its rejection of the expert witness's testimony and improperly weighed certain of the best interest factors relevant to the determination of custody. On remand, the trial courts supplemented its custody order with 40 pages of new material, but otherwise reissued most of the same findings, concluding once again that it was in the child's best interest for mother to have physical and legal custody of the child. Father again appeals, insisting that the trial court did not follow the mandate of the Court of Appeals on remand and erred in standing by its decision in mother's favor. Because the trial court substantially complied with the mandate to meaningfully reconsider expert witness testimony rather than to simply reject it out of hand, the Court of Appeals could not say that the trial court abused its discretion. Although the Court of Appeals still did not necessarily feel the trial court's analysis more than adequately explained a reasonable basis for the trial court's ruling, the decision does at least articulate a reasonable basis and also weighed expert testimony in the context of all the other evidence before the court. The trial court failed on remand to address the concerns of the Court of Appeals with regard to the special master's testimony and did not substantially comply with the remand mandate in that regard. However, the Court of Appeals will affirm the trial court's determination unless the Court of Appeals concludes that a contrary outcome as to that particular factual finding or legal conclusion would change the trial court's ultimate decision, which it did not find in this case. In the prior decision of the Court of Appeals, it held that the trial court abused its discretion in concluding that the trial court was not tasked with deciding whether mother was emotionally stable, but rather whether she was more emotionally stable than the father. Thus, the Court of Appeals was unable to see how the trial court could have reached the conclusion that the emotional stability factor weighed in mother's favor without making any findings regarding father's emotional stability. On remand, the trial court found that this factor was neutral, albeit in a way the Court of Appeals found to be disappointingly lacking in specifics in substance. The trial court originally did not consider the parent's relative willingness to facilitate contact and a positive relationship between the child and the other parent as required by Utah Code sections 30-3-10 and 30-3-10.2. Instead, it considered only whether the evidence of mother's interference with visitation constituted a material change in circumstances. The Court of Appeals concluded that it was unnecessary for the court to address whether a material change in circumstances had occurred under the circumstances of this case, and that the trial court's original conclusion that mother's interference was not a material change in circumstances was both irrelevant and potentially prejudicial to father because it placed an undue burden on father to demonstrate mother's severe interference with visitation rather than weighing the parent's relative ability to facilitate visitation. On remand, the trial court substantially complied with the Court of Appeals mandate. For example, The trial court found that mother had only once interfered with visitation, and it concluded that she interfered because of her good faith but unfounded concern about abuse. And the trial court found that mother generally facilitated visitation and encouraged good relations between child and father. The trial court also concluded that father's failure to facilitate meaningful, lengthy conversations between child and mother indicated that mother is more likely to facilitate a relationship between child and father than father is likely to facilitate a relationship between mother and child. So, with limited exceptions, the trial court on remand substantially complied with the Court of Appeals remand instructions. To the extent that it did not, the Court of Appeals concluded that reversal and remand are not warranted, as a different outcome following a further remand was deemed unlikely given the limited importance of those few areas where the Court of Appeals could ask the trial court to take a third look and more fully explain itself. The moral of the second Woodward versus Lafranca decision: to say that trial courts in divorce cases have broad discretion is an extraordinary understatement.